The war was already lost, why did they keep fighting? A narrative script for voice performance *. The question haunts the pages of history like a ghost that refuses to rest. When the outcome becomes inevitable, when every strategic assessment points to defeat, when the maps themselves seem to scream surrender, why do soldiers continue to fight? Why do nations pour their remaining resources into a cause already lost? This is not a story about victory. It's not even a story about hope. This is a story about the strange, terrible, and profoundly human reasons why men and women kept fighting long after the war was already lost. Part 1, The Realization, April 1945. The bunker in Berlin. The air thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of desperation. Officers huddle around maps that tell a story no amount of wishful thinking can rewrite. The red circles are closing in from the east. The blue and white from the west. The Reich that was promised 1,000 years has perhaps 1,000 hours left. And yet, the fighting continues. In the Pacific, on islands whose names most people cannot pronounce, Japanese soldiers dig deeper into volcanic rock, preparing for battles they know they cannot win. Their homeland has been firebombed. Their navy rests at the bottom of the ocean. American forces possess a weapon so terrible that it can erase a city in an instant. And yet, the fighting continues. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Confederacy in 1865, fighting on even as Sherman carved a path of destruction through the South. The French at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, surrounded and outgunned, holding out for weeks. The Argentinians in the Falklands in 1982, facing a superior British force, knowing that defeat was not a possibility but a certainty. Why? The simple answer, because they were ordered to, feels insufficient. Orders can be disobeyed. Mutinies happen. Soldiers have laid down their arms throughout history when the futility became too overwhelming. So why, in these cases, did they fight on? Part 2, The Soldier's Calculus. Let me tell you about Lieutenant Franz Weber. Not a famous man. Not a hero in the traditional sense. Just a young officer in the Wehrmacht in the spring of 1945, holding a position outside of Dresden with what remained of his company. Franz knew the war was lost. He'd known it since Stalingrad, if he was being honest with himself. Certainly since the Allies landed in Normandy. The propaganda still spoke of wonder weapons and strategic victories, but Franz had learned to read between the lines of every communiqué, to see the defeat hidden in every strategic withdrawal. His men knew it too. You could see it in their eyes around the campfire, in the way they cleaned their weapons with mechanical precision but without conviction, in how they wrote letters home that never spoke of victory, only of endurance. So why did Franz and his men stay at their posts? Why didn't they simply walk away? The answer, Franz would later explain to his grandchildren, was complex. It was partly about his comrades, the men he'd fought beside for 3 years. To abandon them felt like a betrayal worse than any military defeat. It was partly about identity, he'd been a soldier for so long that he didn't know how to be anything else. It was partly about fear, fear of being labeled a deserter, fear of courts-martial, fear of what happened to soldiers who gave up. But mostly, Franz stayed because going home meant confronting what came next. As long as the war continued, there was structure, purpose, a clear enemy and a defined role. Peace meant facing the ruins of everything he'd known, meant acknowledging complicity in horrors he'd witnessed but felt powerless to stop, meant building a new life in a world that would rightfully despise everything he'd fought for. The war was a known hell. Peace was an unknown one. And sometimes, humans choose the devil they know. Franz's story is not unique. Multiply it by millions, and you begin to understand the psychological architecture that keeps men fighting in lost wars. Part 3, The Officer's Dilemma. Colonel Tadamaki Kuribayashi commanded the Japanese forces at Iwo Jima. A sophisticated man who had lived in America, who understood Western military doctrine, who possessed no illusions about Japan's chances of winning the war. His letters home reveal a man acutely aware that he was leading his men into a battle they could not survive, let alone win. And yet, he orchestrated one of the most ferocious defensive stands of the Pacific War. Why? For officers like Kuribayashi, the calculus is different than for the common soldier. They carry the weight of command, the burden of decision. To order a surrender is to accept personal responsibility for defeat in a way that following orders never requires. It means being the one who decides that all those deaths were for nothing, that every sacrifice was in vain. It's easier, psychologically, if not morally, to let the inevitable play out on its own terms. To fight until the decision is taken out of your hands by death or overwhelming force. To let history, rather than your own judgment, be the final arbiter. There's also the matter of institutional pressure. An officer who surrenders a lost position faces court-martial. An officer who fights to the last faces medals, even in defeat. The incentive structure of military hierarchy often rewards futile resistance over pragmatic surrender. Kuribayashi's letters reveal another dimension. He wrote to his family about buying time, about making the Americans pay such a high price for every inch of volcanic ash that they might reconsider the cost of invading the Japanese homeland. In this framework, Iwo Jima wasn't about winning, it was about losing so expensively that the ultimate defeat might be less catastrophic. This is the mathematics of hopeless warfare, not trying to win, but trying to lose less badly. Not seeking victory, but attempting to shape the terms of defeat. It's a grim calculus, but throughout history, officers have made these calculations in the endgame of lost wars. The question becomes not, can we win, but, can we make them reconsider what winning costs? Part 4, the political dimension. But soldiers and officers don't fight in a vacuum. They exist within a political context, and often the continuation of a lost war serves political purposes that have nothing to do with military victory. Consider the final months of the American Civil War. By early 1865, the Confederacy was finished. Sherman had completed his march to the sea. Grant had Lee pinned in Petersburg. The blockade had strangled southern ports. No European power was coming to recognize or assist the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis knew this. Robert E. Lee knew this. Every Confederate general with a functioning brain knew this. So why didn't they surrender in February? Or March? Why did they let the war grind on through April, piling up casualties for a cause already dead? The answer lies partly in negotiating position. As long as Confederate armies remained in the field, the South retained some leverage in discussing the terms of reunification. Surrender too early, too completely, and you have no cards to play. Davis hoped that by prolonging the conflict, by demonstrating that the South could make reconstruction painful and costly, he might secure better terms for the defeated states. It was a miscalculation, of course. Lincoln and Grant offered generous terms anyway, and the prolongation of the war only deepened the bitterness that would poison reconstruction. But the logic from Davis's perspective was clear: use military action as a bargaining chip in political negotiations. This pattern repeats. Saddam Hussein in 1991, continuing to fight even as coalition forces decimated his army, hoping that casualties would force a negotiated settlement rather than unconditional surrender. The North Vietnamese in the late 1960s, enduring horrific bombing campaigns not because they thought they could defeat America militarily, but because they calculated correctly that American public opinion would eventually force a withdrawal. Lost wars continue because political leaders use them as tools for shaping the peace. The military objective shifts from winning to creating facts on the ground that improve the post-war position. Part 5, the ideology trap. But there's another reason lost wars continue, one more dangerous and more difficult to escape: ideology. When a cause becomes sacred, when a political movement transforms into a quasi-religion, when national identity merges with a particular vision of destiny, surrender becomes more than military defeat. It becomes existential annihilation, the death of everything that gives life meaning. The Nazi leadership in 1945 could not surrender because their entire worldview was predicated on the superiority of the German race, the inevitability of German dominance, the cosmic struggle against Judaism and Bolshevism. To surrender wasn't just to lose a war, it was to admit that the fundamental premises of their ideology were lies. So they fought on, even ordering the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure, the so-called Nero Decree, on the theory that a Germany that couldn't dominate didn't deserve to exist. Hitler, ranting in his bunker, wasn't just a madman divorced from reality, he was a true believer who couldn't conceptualize a world where his ideology had failed. The Japanese military leadership faced a similar trap. The concept of Bushido, the warrior code, had been twisted into a national ideology that made surrender synonymous with dishonor worse than death. Kamikaze pilots, banzai charges, the exhortation to fight to the last man, these weren't just tactics, they were expressions of a worldview where dying in battle was the only honorable conclusion. When General Anami, the war minister, finally accepted the necessity of surrender in August 1945, he committed suicide. Not from despair, but from the recognition that his ideology demanded it. The war could end, but the ideology required blood. Ideology creates a prison where rationality cannot reach. It transforms losing into winning, as long as you remain pure to the cause. It recodes defeat as martyrdom, slaughter as sacrifice, the end as the beginning of a longer story where ultimate vindication awaits. This is perhaps the most troubling answer to our question. Wars continue after they're lost because some beliefs cannot coexist with surrender. The war becomes a ritual, a performance of commitment to ideas that have become untethered from reality. Part 6, the psychological dimension. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that comes from holding contradictory beliefs. The human mind does extraordinary things to resolve this discomfort, often rewriting reality rather than accepting truths that conflict with our self-image. Now imagine you've spent years fighting for a cause. You've seen friends die. You've killed others. You've endured hardships that would break most people. Your entire adult life has been oriented around this struggle. And now someone tells you it was all for nothing. The cause is lost. Everything you sacrificed was wasted. The psychological pain of accepting this reality is almost unbearable. So the mind rebels. It finds reasons to continue. It interprets every small victory as a sign of possible reversal. It focuses on anecdotes that support hope while ignoring the overwhelming evidence of defeat. This isn't stupidity. It's the mind protecting itself from a truth too painful to integrate. Veterans of lost wars often speak of this phenomenon years later, once distance has allowed perspective. They describe how they convinced themselves, against all evidence, that somehow things would turn around. They believed in wonder weapons, in political changes, in divine intervention, anything to avoid confronting the unbearable reality that their suffering had no redemptive meaning. There's also the sunk cost fallacy at work. We continue investing in failing ventures because we've already invested so much that stopping feels like making all previous investments worthless. If we've already sacrificed 1,000 lives, how can we justify surrender before we've given 10,000? And if 10,000, why not 100,000? The logic is obviously flawed, but it's psychologically powerful. Each new death becomes both a tragedy and a justification for the next death. The pile of sacrifices grows so large that we can't see past it to the exit. Combat veterans also speak of the strange bonds that form in war, bonds stronger than family, than marriage, than any peacetime friendship. Your survival depends on the man next to you. His depends on you. To leave him is unthinkable, even if staying means dying together in a lost cause. So men continue fighting not for ideology or politics or strategy, but for each other. The war becomes personal, local, about the few square feet of earth you occupy with your brothers in arms. Whether the war as a whole is won or lost becomes almost irrelevant compared to the question of whether you'll betray the men who depend on you. This is perhaps the most human reason for fighting lost wars. It's not grand or strategic or even particularly rational. It's simply that leaving feels worse than staying, even if staying means death. Part 7, the communication breakdown. Sometimes wars continue after they're lost because nobody can figure out how to say so. Communication in warfare is notoriously difficult. Information moves slowly, gets distorted, becomes politicized. Lower ranks often have a clearer picture of tactical reality than high command, but that reality doesn't travel upward effectively. Meanwhile, high command has strategic information that doesn't reach the front lines. The result is often a deadly mismatch of understanding. In Vietnam, American military leadership in Saigon was reading casualty ratios and body counts that suggested the war was being won, while soldiers in the field knew they were fighting an unwinnable conflict. The information gap was so severe that officers sometimes falsified reports rather than deliver news their superiors didn't want to hear. Similarly, in the final years of the Soviet-Afghan War, field commanders knew the situation was hopeless, but political pressure in Moscow meant that admitting defeat was career suicide. Reports were massaged, failures were spun as successes, and the war ground on long after everyone privately acknowledged it was lost. There's also the problem of face-saving. No general wants to be the one who tells the president that the war is lost. No politician wants to tell their constituents that their sons died for nothing. So everyone waits for someone else to state the obvious, and while they wait, more people die. This dynamic is exacerbated in authoritarian systems where telling truth to power can be dangerous. When dictators kill messengers who bring bad news, messengers stop bringing bad news. The leader becomes isolated in a bubble of optimistic lies, making decisions based on fantasy while reality rages outside. Hitler's infamous table talks from the bunker reveal a man completely disconnected from the actual state of the war, moving phantom divisions on maps, planning counteroffensives with armies that had been destroyed weeks earlier. His staff knew the truth but couldn't or wouldn't confront him with it. Sometimes the communication breakdown is more subtle. Different stakeholders define winning and losing differently. Political leaders might see a war as lost when they can't achieve their political objectives, while military leaders see the war as winnable if they can achieve tactical victories. Neither can communicate effectively because they're speaking different languages. And sometimes, the simple logistics of arranging a surrender are more complex than fighting. Who has the authority to surrender? Who on the other side has the authority to accept? What are the terms? How do you communicate these things across battle lines? While these questions get sorted out, battles continue simply from momentum and confusion. Part 8, The Power of Propaganda. Propaganda is most effective not when it's most believed, but when it makes disbelief socially costly. In the late stages of lost wars, propaganda rarely convinces anyone of imminent victory. Soldiers aren't stupid. They can see the evidence of defeat all around them. But propaganda creates a shared fiction that everyone must pretend to believe, because breaking the fiction means being labeled a traitor, a defeatist, a coward. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, in his final radio addresses, spoke of final victory with such conviction that you might almost believe he believed it. He didn't, of course. His private diaries reveal a man who knew Germany was finished. But the propaganda served a different purpose. It maintained the social cohesion necessary to keep the machinery of war functioning. As long as everyone pretended to believe in victory, the army remained an army. Orders were followed. Positions were held. The moment the shared fiction collapsed, the moment people started openly acknowledging defeat, the whole structure would fall apart. So Goebbels kept broadcasting, kept promising wonder weapons and strategic brilliance, not to convince anyone but to maintain the pretense that had to be maintained. This phenomenon appears in every prolonged conflict. North Vietnamese propaganda during the American War claimed victories that clearly hadn't happened, reported casualty figures that were obvious fabrications. But the propaganda wasn't really about factual accuracy, it was about creating a narrative framework that justified continued sacrifice. The interesting thing about wartime propaganda is that it often works best on the people creating it. The propagandist, having spent years crafting messages of inevitable victory, becomes partially convinced by their own rhetoric. They've invested so much in the narrative that they can't abandon it even when reality demolishes its premises. There's also the audience problem. Propaganda creates expectations among the civilian population. If you've spent years telling your people that victory is certain, that the enemy is weak, that your forces are invincible, how do you suddenly announce defeat? The psychological whiplash could be dangerous, potentially triggering revolt or collapse. So leaders continue the propaganda, continue the war, because they've painted themselves into a rhetorical corner from which there's no easy exit. Part 9, The Hope for Miracle Throughout History. Lost wars have continued on the slim hope that something might change. An ally might enter the conflict. A new weapon might turn the tide. Political changes in the enemy's capital might shift their resolve. The weather might provide an advantage. These hopes are rarely rational, but they're psychologically powerful. Point 1 Pretended to believe in victory, the army remained an army. The Confederacy fought on partly hoping that Britain or France might recognize their independence and provide support. That support never came, but the possibility of it justified another month of fighting, then another, then another. Nazi Germany pinned hopes on several potential miracles. The alliance between the capitalist West and Communist Soviet Union would collapse, and they'd turn on each other. Roosevelt would die and his successor would seek peace. New jet fighters and rockets would devastate Allied air forces. None of these things happened, or when they did, they didn't matter. But the possibility kept the war machine grinding. Japan held out for a Soviet-mediated peace right up until the atomic bombs fell, despite Stalin having already agreed to enter the Pacific War against them. The hope was baseless, but it provided a justification for rejecting the Potsdam Declaration. In our own era, we've seen this pattern repeat. Iraqi forces in 1991 hoped the Arab world would unite against the Western coalition. It didn't. Serbian forces in 1999 hoped Russian intervention would check NATO. It didn't. These hopes were mirages, but they were substantial enough to justify continued resistance. The psychology here is understandable. When you're facing certain defeat, even a 1% chance of something changing the equation seems worth pursuing. And perhaps more importantly, as long as there's a theoretical path to avoiding defeat, leaders can avoid confronting their responsibility for the catastrophe. The hope for a miracle becomes an excuse for avoiding hard choices. There's also a more calculating version of this. Sometimes leaders don't genuinely believe a miracle will save them, but they use the rhetoric of possible miracles to maintain morale and cohesion while they pursue other goals, negotiating better surrender terms, securing their own escape, destroying evidence of war crimes. The miracle narrative serves as a cover for endgame strategies that have nothing to do with winning. Part 10, The Vengeance Impulse. There's a final reason lost wars continue, one that's rarely spoken aloud but is powerfully present, the desire to hurt the enemy even in defeat. If you can't win, you can at least make them bleed for their victory. This impulse appears throughout military history. Scorched earth tactics, the destruction of infrastructure, the use of civilian populations as shields, these aren't strategies for winning. They're strategies for making the enemy's victory as costly and bitter as possible. Hitler's Nero decree ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure as Allied forces advanced. If Germany couldn't have victory, at least the Allies would inherit ruins. It was petulant and evil, but it was also a clear expression of the vengeance impulse. Japanese kamikazes in the final year of the Pacific War weren't going to change the war's outcome, but they could kill Americans. If Japan was going down, it would take as many of its enemies with it as possible. This impulse is particularly strong when a war has been brutal and atrocities have been committed. Soldiers who know they'll face war crimes trials have little incentive to surrender peacefully. Better to fight to the death and take some enemies with you. The vengeance impulse is often mixed with a desire to validate suffering. If we've endured horror, our enemies should endure it too. If we're going to lose everything, they should at least feel pain. It's not rational, not strategic, but it's deeply human in its pettiness and rage. This is perhaps the darkest answer to our question. Wars sometimes continue not from hope or strategy or confusion, but from pure spite. From the desire to hurt because we've been hurt, to destroy because we've been destroyed. It transforms war from a political instrument into a mutual suicide pact, where both sides continue fighting not for any positive goal but simply to ensure the other side suffers too. Part 11. The institutional momentum. Sometimes the simplest answer is the truest. wars continue because the institutional machinery of war is hard to stop. Think about the vast apparatus required to wage modern war. Supply chains stretching across continents. Millions of people employed in war industries. Command structures involving hundreds of thousands of officers. Political systems reconfigured around wartime priorities. Economies restructured for military production. This machinery, once set in motion, develops its own momentum. Stopping it requires active intervention, difficult decisions, complex coordination. Letting it continue requires nothing but inertia. Factory workers keep making shells because no one's told them to stop. Supply officers keep shipping materials because that's their job. Soldiers keep fighting because orders keep coming. The war perpetuates itself through the simple continuation of routines that have been established. There's also the employment question. In the United States during World War II, millions of people found work in war industries. The war ended the Depression. For many, peace meant unemployment, economic uncertainty, the loss of purpose and income. The same was true in every combatant nation. The people running war industries, staffing military headquarters, working in munitions plants, all had strong personal interests in the war continuing. Not because they were evil or wanted people to die, but because their livelihoods depended on it. This creates a constituency for war's continuation even after its purpose has evaporated. Not a conspiracy, but a diffuse collection of institutional interests all pushing in the same direction. Politicians who've built careers on wartime leadership find peace politically dangerous. Generals whose rank and prestige derive from command positions in wartime face obsolescence in peace. Defense contractors making enormous profits from war production see peace as bankruptcy. None of these groups need to explicitly want the war to continue. They just need to avoid being the ones who actively work to end it. And so it continues, propelled by institutional inertia rather than any strategic vision. Part 12, The Last Stand Mentality. But let's be honest about something that might seem contradictory to everything I've said so far. Sometimes men fight lost wars because there's something magnificent in it. Not in a way that's smart or good or justified. But magnificent nonetheless. The Spartans at Thermopylae knew they were going to die. They marched to that hot gate knowing it was a tomb. But they fought anyway, buying time for Greece to organize its defense. Their last stand has echoed through 25 centuries. The defenders of the Alamo knew Santa Anna's army would overwhelm them. They stayed anyway. Victory or death, their commander wrote, and they got death, but Texas got revolution. These aren't examples of stupid men making bad decisions. These are examples of people choosing to make their deaths mean something. Choosing to transform personal annihilation into a larger narrative that might inspire others. The last stand is a specific psychological space. It's the moment when survival is off the table and the only question left is how you'll be remembered. Will you die in panic and desperation, or will you orchestrate your end into something that speaks to future generations? This impulse shouldn't be romanticized. Most last stands are futile wastes of life. But they tap into something deep in human psychology, the desire to have our existence matter, to be remembered, to transform personal death into collective myth. The soldiers at Bastogne in 1944 weren't fighting a lost war, but they faced impossible odds when surrounded by German forces. Their commander's reply to a surrender demand, "Nuts," has become legendary not because it was strategically brilliant but because it expressed defiance in the face of seeming futility. Human beings will endure remarkable suffering if they believe their suffering has meaning. Take away the chance of victory, and that meaning has to come from somewhere else. Often it comes from the narrative of heroic resistance, of fighting against odds, of going down but going down fighting. This is especially powerful in cultures with strong martial traditions. Japanese Bushido, European concepts of knightly honor, Celtic warrior codes, all emphasize that how you face death matters more than whether you survive. In these frameworks, a glorious defeat could be more valuable than a shameful survival. So men keep fighting lost wars partly because surrender means accepting not just defeat but ordinariness. The Last Stand offers a kind of immortality through story. Part 13, because surrender might be worse, we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes soldiers keep fighting lost wars because surrender truly might be worse than death. This isn't always paranoia or propaganda. History is filled with examples of surrendering forces being massacred, enslaved, or tortured. Sometimes the fear of what comes after surrender is entirely rational. Soviet soldiers in World War II fought with particular ferocity partly because they knew what awaited them in German captivity. Of the nearly 6 million Soviet POWs captured by Germany, about 3 million died. Starvation, exposure, execution, surrender was often just death by another name. Similarly, German soldiers on the Eastern Front fought desperately in the war's final phase not from ideology but from terror of Soviet vengeance. They'd witnessed or participated in horrific atrocities in Russia. They knew retribution was coming. Better to die fighting than face what Soviet captivity might bring. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered in the Pacific partly because their own military had told them Americans would torture and kill prisoners. This was propaganda, but it was also based on some real incidents where surrendering Japanese troops had been shot. The propaganda was effective because it contained enough truth to be believable. In more recent conflicts, we've seen the same dynamic. ISIS fighters fought to the death in their final strongholds partly because they knew the war crimes tribunals that awaited them. Taliban fighters continued resistance in 2001 despite hopeless odds partly from fear of Northern Alliance reprisals. The calculus is grim but simple: if surrender means death anyway, you might as well die fighting. At least that way you might take some enemies with you, might protect your comrades a little longer, might die with a weapon in your hand rather than on your knees. This creates a terrible spiral. Fear of retribution leads to desperate resistance. Desperate resistance causes casualties that increase the desire for retribution, which increases the fear, which increases the resistance. Breaking this cycle requires credible guarantees of humane treatment for surrendering forces. The Geneva Conventions exist partly to address this problem. But in the chaos of war, especially in the bitter endgame of lost conflicts, such guarantees often feel meaningless. So men keep fighting not from hope of victory but from fear of what defeat might bring. Part 14, the personal equation. But let me tell you about Corporal Yamamoto, because his story illustrates something all the grand strategic and psychological explanations miss. Yamamoto was a 23-year-old Japanese soldier on Okinawa in 1945. He kept a diary that was recovered after the battle. By late May, he knew the war was lost. He wrote about it explicitly. He knew Japan would surrender, knew his island would fall, knew he would probably die. But he kept fighting. Why? His diary entry from June 2 provides the answer, and it's mundane in a way that might disappoint those looking for grand narratives. If I abandon my position, I don't know where else to go. This hillside is home now. These men are my family. If I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather it be here, with them, than lost and alone somewhere else. Sometimes the answer to our question is simply that lost wars continue because individual humans find small reasons to stay where they are. Not ideology or fear or strategy, but simple human inertia. This place is familiar. These people are known. Change, even change that might save your life, is frightening. Or consider the account of a German private in Berlin in April 1945, interviewed decades later. When asked why he didn't desert in those final days, he laughed. Desert to where? My hometown was rubble. My family was scattered or dead. Berlin was falling apart, but it was falling apart with hot food and other soldiers who understood. Walking away meant being alone in a destroyed country with no plan and no purpose. At least the army told me what to do each day. The continuation of lost war. These aren't the reasons that make it into history books, but they might be more common than any of the grand explanations. War creates its own world, with its own rhythms and rules. After years of it, peace becomes the foreign concept. Soldiers describe feeling more comfortable in combat zones than in their own homes, more at ease with men who might kill them than with family members who love them. The war becomes identity. Take it away, and who are you? What do you do? Where do you belong? So the fighting continues partly from an inability to imagine existence outside the context of war. The end is terrifying not because of what might happen but because of the void it represents. Part 15, The Legacy Question. There's one more dimension we need to explore, the question of how history will remember you. Leaders of losing wars are acutely aware that history's judgment awaits them. The narrative that forms around defeat can either cast them as villains who prolonged suffering unnecessarily, or as heroes who fought against impossible odds with courage and determination. This awareness shapes behavior in the war's final phase. Surrender too early, and you're a coward who gave up when victory might still have been possible. Fight to the absolute end, and you're a leader who never abandoned their cause or their people. Richard Nixon's prolongation of the Vietnam War is often explained in these terms. By 1969, he knew the war couldn't be won in any meaningful sense. But he also knew that the president who lost Vietnam would be pilloried by history. So he pursued peace with honor, a strategy that essentially meant continuing the war while looking for a politically acceptable exit. Thousands died while Nixon sought an exit that would protect his historical legacy. The war wasn't being fought to win, it was being fought to lose in a way that wouldn't destroy his presidency. This calculation appears throughout history. Leaders extend conflicts not from military necessity but from concern about historical judgment. They want to be remembered as fighters, not quitters. As leaders who exhausted every option before accepting defeat, not ones who gave up prematurely. The tragedy is that this often makes the ultimate judgment harsher. History tends to condemn leaders who prolonged suffering for vanity more severely than those who made hard but necessary decisions to end hopeless conflicts. Robert E. Lee's reputation might be better today if he'd surrendered at Petersburg and prevented the final weeks of Confederate collapse. Hitler would still be history's monster if he'd surrendered in 1944, but he might have spared Germany the total devastation of that final year. But in the moment, facing the judgment of posterity, the temptation is always to fight on. To demonstrate commitment. To prove you weren't the weak link. To show that you exhausted every possibility before accepting the unacceptable. Legacy concerns can be particularly powerful for military officers, who know their entire career will be judged by how they handled their final command. Better to go down fighting than to be the general who gave up. Conclusion, the unbearable weight of ending. So we return to our question, why do they keep fighting when the war is already lost? The answer, unsatisfyingly, is that there isn't one answer. There are dozens, hundreds, operating simultaneously at different levels. The soldier fights for different reasons than the officer, who fights for different reasons than the political leader. The reasons that seem compelling on Tuesday might be replaced by different reasons on Wednesday. But perhaps there's a thread running through all these explanations. Perhaps it comes down to this: ending a war is harder than continuing it. Continuing requires only momentum. The machinery keeps running. Orders keep flowing. Soldiers keep soldiering. It's the path of least resistance, the choice that requires no difficult decisions. Ending requires will. It requires someone to stand up and say, enough. To accept responsibility for defeat. To make peace with failure. To face the uncertain future. To tell the dead that their sacrifice didn't lead to victory. To rebuild amid ruins. Ending requires the most difficult thing humans can do, acknowledging that we were wrong, that our efforts were futile, that the cause we believed in has failed. So wars continue in their death throes not from strength but from weakness. Not from conviction but from the inability to face what comes next. They continue because stopping is harder than going on. The men who finally end lost wars, Lincoln offering generous terms at Appomattox, Hirohito breaking the deadlock to accept surrender, de Klerk negotiating the end of apartheid, these are often history's unsung heroes. Not because they won, but because they had the courage to lose consciously, deliberately, with some control over the terms. It takes no courage to keep fighting. It takes extraordinary courage to say, no more. The soldiers on Okinawa who fought to the last. The defenders of Berlin who died in rubble. The Confederate forces who kept marching long after the cause was dead. They weren't cowards or fools. They were humans trapped in a machine that was easier to feed than to stop. And the machine fed on blood and years and futures until someone, usually exhausted, usually too late, finally found the strength to say, enough. That's why they kept fighting when the war was already lost. Not for any good reason, but because good reasons are luxuries that war's final days rarely afford. The war was lost, but ending it required admitting it was lost. And that admission was harder than death. The question that haunts history isn't really, why did they keep fighting? The question is, why is it so hard for us to stop? Epilogue, a personal reflection. If you've stayed with me through this long examination, you might be feeling uncomfortable. That's appropriate. There are no satisfying answers here, no moments where everything clicks into place and makes sense. We want history's tragedies to have meaning, to teach clear lessons, to divide neatly into wisdom and folly. But the prolongation of lost wars resists such simple categorization. It's messy, contradictory, simultaneously understandable and inexcusable. Every reason I've described for continuing hopeless wars has some validity. And every reason is also insufficient to justify the suffering that continuation causes. Perhaps the real lesson is about the nature of war itself. Once begun, it develops its own gravity, pulls in its own direction, becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The question isn't just why lost wars continue, but why wars prove so hard to end even when everyone involved wants them over. And perhaps, most uncomfortably, we need to ask how many current conflicts are continuing for the same reasons past ones did. How many soldiers today are fighting in wars their leaders know cannot be won? How many causes consume lives and treasure in pursuit of outcomes that are already foreclosed? The wars we study in history books aren't safely in the past. Their dynamics repeat in our present. The same psychological forces, the same institutional pressures, the same ideological traps operate today. The war was already lost, why did they keep fighting? They kept fighting for reasons human and institutional, noble and base, conscious and unconscious. They kept fighting because stopping was hard and continuing was easy. They kept fighting because someone had to decide to stop, and making that decision meant accepting responsibility for everything that decision implied. And tomorrow, somewhere in the world, the same dynamics will unfold again. Unless we learn to recognize them. Unless we find the courage to end hopeless conflicts before they grind through their terrible final stages. The dead can't teach us. But their deaths can, if we're willing to look honestly at why they died, and what that says about our species' relationship with violence, with sacrifice, with the terrible momentum of war. That's why this story matters. Not as history, but as warning. Asterisk.